Duke pretended to be a countryman to find love, and only the rejected young woman loved him for real. Julian Montgomery carried the weight of a title that felt more like a prison than a blessing. At 28, the young Duke had met dozens of women who smiled at his coat of arms, but never at his heart. The last attempt at an arranged marriage with a baron's daughter had ended in humiliation when he discovered she was carrying on a secret affair with another man, interested only in his fortune. That was when he made the most radical decision of his life. On a rainy afternoon in March, Julian informed his butler that he would be leaving on a trip with no set return date. He packed only a few simple clothes, left all symbols of nobility at the palace, and headed to the countryside of Virginia, where no one would know his face. He wanted to find a woman who would love him for the man he was, not the Duke he had inherited. The small town of Willow Creek seemed like the perfect place to start over. Surrounded by apple orchards and cornfields, the rural community lived off the land and the simple bonds between neighbors. Julian rented a small room at Martha's boarding house, run by a 60-year-old woman who asked just enough questions not to seem rude. He introduced himself as a laborer from another region who had come looking for opportunities. He found work at Silas's farmstead, where he quickly proved that his delicate hands were not used to hard labor. The other workers found his upright posture, his polite way of speaking, and his knowledge of subjects a simple farmhand shouldn't master strange. To explain the differences, he made up a story about having worked as a teacher's assistant before losing his family in an accident. It was on an afternoon of apple picking that he first saw the woman who would change his life forever. Sarah Jenkins was 24 years old and worked as a seamstress in the home of the wealthiest family in town. Her long brown hair swayed as she walked down the main street, carrying a basket of fabrics. There was something in her eyes that conveyed a deep sadness, as if she carried an old pain in her chest. Julian learned from Mrs. Martha that Sarah had been engaged to the mayor's son, but the wedding had been publicly called off when the young man's family discovered she was the daughter of a washerwoman. The humiliation had been so great that she had shut herself off from any kind of romantic relationship, devoting herself entirely to her work and to caring for her sick mother. During the first few weeks, Julian tried to get closer to her on the occasions he ran into her at the market or at church. Sarah treated him with cold politeness, answering only what was necessary before quickly walking away. The constant rejection left him intrigued and even more interested. He was used to women throwing themselves at his feet, but here was one who seemed immune to any charm. One day, seeing her struggling to carry heavy bags of fabric, Julian offered to help. She hesitated for a moment, but practical need won over distrust. During the walk to her house, he tried to make conversation about everyday matters, but she kept her answers short and direct. It was as if she had built a wall around her heart to protect herself from new disappointments. Sarah's house was on a side street, small but well kept, with a garden where she grew herbs and a few flowers. Julian noticed that she seemed to find peace in that little green corner, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she watered the plants. It was then that he had an idea to earn her trust gradually. The following week, he showed up at her door with apple saplings he had set aside from the farm where he worked. He explained that he had noticed how well she took care of her garden and thought she might like to try growing a new crop. Sarah was surprised by the gesture, but accepted the seedlings with a small smile that briefly lit up her face. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Little by little, Julian began showing up to help with the garden. Always with plausible excuses, he'd offer to weed, plant, or water when she was busy with her sewing. Sarah initially resisted, saying she didn't need anyone's charity. But he insisted gently, explaining that he enjoyed working the land and that it helped him unwind after long, hard days at the farm. During these visits, casual conversations about plants began to deepen. Julian discovered that Sarah had learned to sew with her mother as a child and dreamed of one day having her own workshop. She, for her part, grew intrigued by his knowledge of different soil types and cultivation techniques, far beyond what a simple farmhand should know. When questioned about his seemingly refined education, Julian explained that he had lived with the professor he'd worked for over a few years. He said the man was passionate about agriculture and had taught him a great deal about the land. The explanation seemed to satisfy Sarah, who gradually began to relax in his presence. A month after their first meeting, Sarah fell ill with a high fever that kept her bedridden for several days. Her mother, already elderly and frail, couldn't properly care for her daughter. It was the neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy, who told Julian about the situation. Without hesitation, he showed up at their house with chicken broth and medicinal herbs he had prepared. Sarah was pale and delirious when he arrived. Julian took over her care with a competence that surprised her mother. He knew exactly how to prepare compresses, when to administer the remedies, and which teas were most effective at bringing down the fever. For 3 days, he barely left her bedside, monitoring every change in her condition. When the fever finally broke, Sarah opened her eyes and saw him sleeping in the chair next to her bed, exhausted but present. For the first time in years, someone had taken care of her without ulterior motives, without expecting anything in return. The image of that kind man watching over her touched her still wounded heart deeply. Once she fully recovered, Sarah could no longer keep her cold distance from Julian. She had seen his true nature during the most vulnerable moments of her life. She began welcoming him into her home more naturally, letting conversations stretch on for hours while she sewed and he helped with small repairs. During those quiet afternoons, Julian discovered an intelligent, courageous woman, full of dreams that circumstances had forced her to keep locked away. Sarah talked about books she borrowed from the town library, places she'd like to visit, and her desire to expand her sewing work. He listened with genuine attention, asking questions that showed real interest in her ideas. For her part, Sarah grew increasingly intrigued by Julian's mysterious past. He spoke little about his former life, always changing the subject when questions got too deep. He said he had lost his family at a young age and preferred not to revisit painful times. She respected his silence, understanding that some wounds were too deep to be easily exposed. Their friendship was turning into something deeper when an unexpected situation shook the peace they had built. Bradley Sterling, Sarah's former fiancé, returned to town after 2 years studying in Richmond. Now a law graduate and professionally established, he came with the stated intention of winning her back. Bradley sought out Sarah on a Saturday afternoon when she was sewing on the porch of her house. He arrived with flowers and an elaborate speech about how he had been young and influenced by his family at the time of the breakup. He claimed to have matured and come to understand that true love was more important than social conventions. He was asking for a second chance to prove he had changed. Sarah's answer was clear and definitive. She looked him in the eyes with a firmness she hadn't possessed before and said that time had passed. She explained that she had found someone who valued her exactly as she was, without needing to go through transformations or trials of love. Bradley was visibly shaken to discover there was another man in her life. When Julian showed up for his evening garden work, he found Sarah still visibly tense from the encounter with Bradley. She told him about the visit and made it clear she had rejected any possibility of reconciliation. Julian felt a mixture of relief and concern, knowing that men like Bradley rarely accepted rejections calmly. In the following days, Bradley began to circulate through town asking questions about the mysterious worker who had won Sarah over. He wanted to understand how a simple farmhand had managed to succeed where he, with all his education and social standing, had failed. The information he obtained only increased his irritation and suspicion. The farmhands commented on Julian's delicate hands, his upright posture, the refined vocabulary that sometimes slipped out in conversation. Some mentioned that he seemed to know too much for someone of humble origins. Bradley began to suspect there was something strange about that man's story. Meanwhile, Julian and Sarah were living increasingly intense moments together. He had become a natural part of her routine, helping with household chores, tending the garden, and providing the companionship she hadn't realized she was missing. During a walk through the wildflower meadows on the outskirts of town, he almost confessed his feelings, but held back at the last moment. The guilt of keeping her deceived was becoming unbearable. Julian saw love growing in Sarah's eyes and knew he would need to make a decision soon. He couldn't keep building a relationship on a lie, but he also feared losing the only woman who had ever truly loved him for the man he was. One afternoon, while picking apples together in the small garden they had expanded, Sarah commented on how safe she felt beside him. She said that for the first time in years, she didn't worry about judgments or expectations. She just allowed herself to be happy. Her words felt like a dagger in Julian's chest, adding even more weight to his deception. That night, alone in his room at Martha's boarding house, Julian wrote a letter telling the whole truth about his identity. He explained the reasons that had led him to that deception and declared his sincere love for her. He planned to deliver the letter the next day, but at dawn he lost his courage and tore the paper into small pieces. Bradley, determined to uncover the truth about his rival, discreetly hired a private investigator from Richmond. He wanted detailed information about Julian's past, convinced there were inconsistencies in his story. The investigator began working with the few pieces of information available about the mysterious farmhand. Meanwhile, the relationship between Julian and Sarah continued to deepen. They had developed a connection that went beyond words, understanding each other through glances and gestures. On weekends, they took long walks along the country trails, talking about dreams and plans for the future. Julian constantly had to invent details about his aspirations, always careful not to contradict his false identity. One night during a heavy rainstorm, Sarah invited Julian to dinner at her house for the first time. Her mother, Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins, had recovered significantly in health and wanted to get to know better the man who was making her daughter smile again. During the simple but lovingly prepared meal, Julian felt more welcomed than he had ever felt at the lavish palace banquets. Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins watched Julian's manners attentively, noticing details that might have escaped Sarah. The way he held his silverware, how he got up to help with the dishes, the respectful yet naturally elegant way he carried himself. There was something about that young man that didn't quite fit the image of a rural farmhand, but she kept her observations to herself. After dinner, when the rain had dwindled to a gentle drizzle, Julian and Sarah sat on the porch to talk. It was in that intimate moment, with the sound of the rain as their soundtrack, that he finally confessed his feelings. He said he had found in her far more than he had ever dreamed of looking for, that she was the woman with whom he wanted to build a real life. Sarah returned his feelings with a sincerity that moved Julian deeply. She told him how she had lost hope in love after the public humiliation of her broken engagement, but that he had restored her faith in the possibility of being loved for who she truly was. Their first kiss happened right there, sealed by the rain that gradually came to a stop. In the following weeks, they officially became a couple in the eyes of the whole town. Sarah's transformation was visible to everyone who knew her. She was smiling openly again, taking part in the community's social activities, and showing a lightness she hadn't had in years. The townsfolk spoke positively about how Julian had been good for her. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and most importantly subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Bradley watched this happiness with growing bitterness and determination. He couldn't accept that he had lost Sarah to someone he considered socially and economically beneath him. The information the investigator began sending only reinforced his conviction that there was something wrong with that whole story. The investigator had found no birth records or official documents proving the identity Julian had assumed in town. He also found no evidence of the family Julian claimed to have lost, or of the teacher he said he had worked for. All the information seemed to have been carefully fabricated. Armed with these discoveries, Bradley decided to confront Julian publicly during Sunday Mass, when the whole community would be present. He wanted to expose the impostor in front of Sarah and the entire town, forcing her to see the truth about the man she had placed her trust in. Julian sensed something was wrong when he noticed whispered conversations that stopped abruptly as he approached. Bradley had begun planting seeds of doubt about his identity, discreetly questioning some of the locals about inconsistencies in the stranger's story. Tension was building around town, though Sarah hadn't noticed it yet. On the Friday before that fateful Sunday, an elegant carriage stopped in front of the boarding house where Julian was staying. The driver asked for him using his real name, surprising Mrs. Martha. Julian managed to convince the woman that there had been a mistake, but he was terrified at the possibility of his true identity being discovered so close to the revelation Bradley was planning. Over the weekend, Julian tried to act normally around Sarah, but she noticed his growing tension. When she asked what was troubling him, he made up a story about thinking of expanding his farming business and feeling anxious about it. Sarah believed the explanation and offered her full support for any decision he made. On Sunday morning, Julian put on his best simple clothes and accompanied Sarah to Mass, unaware that it would be the last time he would walk through town as a man free from his past. The church was more crowded than usual, as if the community sensed that something important was about to happen. During the priest's sermon, Julian noticed Bradley watching him with a malicious smile. There was something in the eyes of Sarah's ex-fiancé that made him sense a storm approaching. He tried to focus on the priest's words, but his mind was restless with a growing feeling of imminent danger. When Mass ended and the faithful began making their way toward the exit, Bradley positioned himself strategically near the main door. It was his chance to confront Julian in front of the entire community, with the evidence he had gathered about his false identity. The moment of truth had arrived, but before Bradley could carry out his plan, the sound of galloping horses interrupted the departing congregation. An official carriage stopped in front of the church in such a hurry that it kicked up a cloud of dust. From the vehicle stepped an elegantly dressed man who clearly did not belong to that rural community. It was Mr. Harrison, the head steward of the duchy, who had traveled for days desperately searching for Julian. He brought urgent news about legal matters that required the Duke's immediate presence. Upon spotting Julian among the congregation, he sighed with relief and went directly to him, completely ignoring the context in which he found himself. What happened next was like a nightmare in slow motion for Julian. Mr. Harrison, relieved to have finally found his master, addressed him with the usual formal protocol, publicly calling him by his full noble title. The entire church square fell into absolute silence upon hearing the words that completely shattered the charade Julian had maintained for months. Sarah was by his side when the revelation happened. Julian saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in her eyes, gradually replacing the initial confusion with a deep pain he would never forget. Tears began to stream down her face as she processed the magnitude of the lie she had lived through all that time. The crowd in the square reacted with a mixture of shock, awe, and indignation. Some couldn't believe they had lived alongside a member of the nobility without knowing it. Others felt deceived and even humiliated for having treated a duke as an equal. But no one felt more betrayed than Sarah, who remained motionless at his side. Julian desperately tried to explain, reaching his hands out toward her, but Sarah recoiled as if he were a dangerous stranger. The pain in her eyes was so intense that he would have preferred a slap to having to endure that look of absolute disappointment. She had placed all her trust in him, had opened her wounded heart, and now discovered that everything had been an elaborate charade. Bradley, who had planned to unmask Julian, was just as surprised as everyone else by the real revelation of his identity. He had never imagined that his rival was truly a member of the high nobility. For a moment, he was torn between the satisfaction of watching Sarah discover the truth and the discomfort of realizing he had challenged someone infinitely superior in social standing. Mr. Harrison, realizing too late the embarrassment he had caused, tried to downplay the situation by explaining that there were urgent matters in the duchy requiring immediate attention. But the damage was already done. The simple life Julian had built in that town had completely crumbled in a matter of minutes. Sarah finally found the strength to speak, but her words came out as a whisper, laden with pain. She asked if anything he had told her was true, if the feelings he had shown had any sincerity. Julian tried to answer, but she raised her hand asking for silence and walked away quickly, pushing through the curious crowd. In the following days, Julian remained at the boarding house while Mr. Harrison handled the preparations for the return to the duchy. He tried several times to talk to Sarah, but she refused to see him. The curtains of her house remained closed, and the neighbors reported that she wasn't receiving visits from anyone. The letters he wrote daily were returned unopened. Julian even went to see Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins, but Sarah's mother, although polite, made it clear that her daughter needed time to process everything that had happened. She said she had never seen Sarah so hurt, not even when Bradley had publicly broken off the engagement. The whole town was talking about the revelation. Some residents speculated about the true motives that had led a duke to disguise himself as a farmhand. Others commented on how Sarah would react to discovering she had fallen in love with someone so far above her social standing. The situation had become the main topic of every conversation. Bradley took advantage of Sarah's emotional confusion to present himself once again as a suitor. He showed up at her house a few days after the revelation, offering a friendly shoulder and support during that difficult time. He argued that now she could see the difference between someone who had lied about their identity and someone who had always been sincere about his intentions. But Sarah could barely get out of bed, let alone think about new relationships. The discovery that she had been deceived for months by someone she completely trusted had reopened all the old wounds from the previous public humiliation. She felt stupid for having believed the invented stories, for having allowed herself to love again. Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins watched her daughter's suffering with a broken heart. She had genuinely liked Julian during the time he spent at her house, and she could swear that his feelings for Sarah were genuine, but she didn't know how to help her daughter overcome the feeling of having been deceived once again in her life. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot who are just starting out. Now continuing. A week after the revelation, Mr. Harrison approached Julian with growing urgency. He explained that there were legal matters in the duchy that could result in the loss of important properties if they weren't resolved quickly. Julian would have to return, whether he wanted to or not. The reality of his social position was exacting the price of the temporary freedom he had allowed himself. On the last night before the mandatory departure, Julian made a desperate decision. He wrote a final letter to Sarah, this time telling the whole truth about his motives. He explained how he had grown tired of the falsehoods of aristocratic life, how he had wanted to find true love, and how she had been the first person to love him for the man he really was, not the title he carried. The letter was long and emotional, detailing every sincere moment they had shared. Julian wrote about how tending the garden with her had been more rewarding than any luxury of his previous life. He described how the simplicity of having dinner at her house had touched his heart more deeply than all the royal banquets he had attended. He asked forgiveness for the lie, but swore that his feelings were completely true. He explained that he had lied about his identity, but never about the love he felt for her. The letter ended with a painful confession. He would renounce everything, absolutely everything, if it meant a chance to win back her trust. This time, instead of delivering the letter personally, he left it with Mrs. Dorothy, Sarah's neighbor, who had always been kind to them both. He asked her to deliver it only when she thought Sarah was emotionally prepared to read it. Mr. Harrison had scheduled the departure for the following morning, and Julian could no longer postpone his return to the dukedom. During the return trip, Julian barely spoke with Mr. Harrison. He gazed out the carriage window, watching the rural landscape gradually give way to the outskirts of Richmond, feeling that he was leaving behind far more than a city. He was leaving behind the only chance he had ever had to be truly loved for who he was. The legal matters in the dukedom were indeed urgent and complex. Julian spent weeks immersed in documents, meetings with lawyers, and decisions about properties. The intense work helped distract him from the constant pain of having lost Sarah, but during the silent nights, the longing came back in full force. Meanwhile, in Willow Creek, Mrs. Dorothy had finally delivered the letter to Sarah. The young woman hesitated to open it for several days, but curiosity finally won over anger. When she read Julian's sincere words, she cried like she hadn't cried since the night of the revelation. For the first time, she began to question whether her reaction had been fair. The letter made her remember all the genuine moments they had shared. How he had taken care of her during her illness, how he had been kind to her mother, how his eyes sparkled when they talked about the future. Could it be possible that all of that had been pretense? Or was there sincerity in his feelings, even if his identity had been false? Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins noticed the change in her daughter's mood after she read the letter. Sarah began spending hours on the porch, looking at the garden they had cultivated together. The apple trees kept growing vigorously, like a constant reminder of the time they had shared. It was impossible to fake that kind of devotion, she thought. Bradley kept visiting regularly, trying to earn a place in Sarah's wounded heart. But she seemed distant even when she was physically present. She responded to his attempts at conversation with monosyllables, and clearly had no romantic interest in resuming any relationship with him. She was completely focused on processing the situation with Julian. 2 weeks after receiving the letter, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone. She announced to her mother that she was going to travel to Richmond to confront Julian in person. She wanted to hear from his own lips the explanations he had to give. She needed to look into his eyes to try to tell truth from lies in his feelings. Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins tried to dissuade her, arguing that an unmarried young woman shouldn't travel alone to find a man, especially a duke. But Sarah was determined. She said she had spent months believing in a charade, and now she needed to know if there was at least some truth amidst so many lies. The bus trip to Richmond took an entire day. Sarah carried only a small suitcase and the dukedom's address, which she had obtained with great effort through acquaintances. Along the way, she mentally rehearsed what she would say when she found him, but she knew that all the prepared words would likely vanish when she stood before him again. Arriving in Richmond, Sarah was impressed by the grandeur of the ducal palace. The imposing gates, the well-kept gardens, and the majestic architecture made her understand for the first time the true extent of the social difference between her and Julian. How naive she had been to believe that a man from that world could genuinely want a simple life with her. When she introduced herself at the gatehouse, asking to speak with the Duke, the guards looked at her with suspicion. A simple young woman from the countryside wasn't usually granted direct access to the nobility. It was necessary to insist and explain that she had urgent personal matters to discuss with Julian before they agreed to relay the message. Julian was in his private library trying to concentrate on financial reports when Mr. Harrison knocked on the door with a puzzled expression on his face. He informed him that there was a young woman at the entrance claiming to have urgent personal matters to discuss. When he mentioned the name Sarah Jenkins, Julian dropped the papers he was holding. Julian's heart raced as he made his way to the main hall to receive Sarah. He hadn't imagined she would travel all the way to Richmond to see him. During the weeks of separation, he had completely lost hope of winning her back. Now he didn't know if her presence there meant a chance at reconciliation, or if she had come only to definitively close the door on any possibility between them. When Sarah entered the hall and saw Julian dressed in the fine clothes befitting his position, the reality of the difference between them hit her with full force. There stood the man she had known as a simple rural worker, but now she could clearly see the aristocratic bearing, the natural elegance that had always been there but that she had attributed to other causes. For a few moments, they simply stood looking at each other in silence. Julian was visibly moved to see her again, but also apprehensive about the reasons for her visit. Sarah, for her part, observed every detail, trying to understand how she had allowed herself to be so completely deceived. The hands that had worked in her garden were the same, but now she could see that they had truly never belonged to a peasant. Sarah was the first to break the silence. With her voice trembling from nervousness, she said she had traveled there to hear from him personally, the reasons that had led him to lie to her for months. She wanted to understand if anything they had experienced together had been real, or if it had all been just a cruel game by a man bored with his privileged life. Julian asked her to sit down and offered her something to drink, but Sarah politely declined. She said she preferred to remain standing and hear what he had to say. The formality of the situation contrasted painfully with the intimacy they had shared during the months in Willow Creek. With his voice heavy with emotion, Julian began to explain how he had grown tired of the falseness of aristocratic life. He told her about the arranged marriages with women interested only in his fortune, about the loneliness of being loved only for the title and never for the person. He explained that he had left for the countryside in search of something he thought he would never find, true love. Sarah listened to him in silence, watching every expression on his face as he spoke. There was sincerity in his eyes, but she had been deceived before and no longer knew what to believe. When he finished explaining the reasons for the charade, she asked directly whether the feelings he had shown were genuine or whether they too had been part of the act. Julian stepped closer to her, but stopped respectfully at a distance that wouldn't intimidate her. With a firm but emotional voice, he swore that every moment of love, every gesture of affection, every word of tenderness had been absolutely sincere. He said he had lied about his identity, but never about what he felt for her. He explained that she had been the first person to love him for the man he truly was, not the duke he played. Tears began to stream down Sarah's face as he spoke. Part of her wanted to believe his words, because she knew the moments they had shared were too intense to have been completely faked, but another part of her still felt deeply betrayed by the elaborate lie he had maintained for months. Julian, seeing her cry, said he was willing to give up everything if it meant a chance to win her back. He offered to publicly renounce the dukedom, to abdicate all privileges and riches, to prove that she mattered more than any title. He said he had learned to be truly happy during the simple months they had spent together. The offer left Sarah even more confused. How could she ask someone to give up an entire life of privilege because of her? At the same time, the sincerity of the proposal made her question her own doubts about his feelings. Was it possible that he really loved her that much? For hours they talked about everything that had happened. Julian patiently answered all of Sarah's questions, explaining every lie he had told and the reasons behind each one. She wanted to understand how it had been possible to be so completely deceived about the identity of someone she had lived with so intimately. When the sun began to set, Sarah said she needed time to process everything she had heard. Julian offered her lodging at the palace, but she preferred to stay at a simple boarding house in town. She needed space to think clearly about the future, away from the influence of his presence. That night, alone in her room at the boarding house, Sarah recalled every moment they had shared in Willow Creek. She tried to identify signs she should have noticed, clues that might have revealed his true identity. But honestly, she couldn't find a single moment when his feelings hadn't seemed genuine. The next day, she returned to the palace for a second conversation. This time, Julian received her in the garden, a less formal setting than the main hall. Sarah said she had spent the night thinking and had come to some conclusions about their situation. She explained that she could understand his reasons for the charade and could even believe in the sincerity of his feelings. But she said she needed to know whether he was truly willing to live a simple life or if he would eventually miss the privileges he was accustomed to. She didn't want to build a relationship based on sacrifices that would turn into resentment in the future. Julian replied that he had discovered true happiness during those simple months in Willow Creek. He said that waking up beside her would be worth more than all the treasures of the dukedom, that he would rather work the land with her than live surrounded by luxury and loneliness. But Sarah still had doubts about whether those words would hold true over time. That was when Julian made a decision that completely changed the course of the conversation. He said he no longer wanted empty words. He wanted concrete proof of his feelings. Right there, in Sarah's presence, he called for Mr. Harrison and dictated a formal letter of renunciation to the dukedom. He transferred all titles and properties to the closest cousin in the line of succession. Sarah was shocked by the radical decision. She tried to stop him, saying she didn't want him to make such drastic sacrifices, but Julian was determined. He explained that abandoning a life that made him unhappy to build something real with the woman he loved was no sacrifice at all. The renunciation was made official that same day, with legal documents that made the decision irreversible. Julian made it clear to Sarah that he hadn't done it to manipulate her, but because he had finally found the courage to choose true happiness over social conventions. Now he was just an ordinary man who loved an ordinary woman. Faced with such a demonstration of love and commitment, Sarah finally allowed her heart to overcome her doubts. She nodded that she was willing to try rebuilding the trust between them, as long as he never lied to her again about anything, no matter how small. Julian solemnly swore that there would never again be secrets between them. The return to Willow Creek was completely different from the departure. This time, they traveled together, as a couple that had overcome a deep crisis and come out stronger on the other side. Julian had sold his personal belongings to buy a piece of land near town, where he planned to build an entirely new life. The news of the Duke's resignation and his return to live as an ordinary man caused an uproar in Richmond, but in Willow Creek it was met with mixed reactions. Some locals admired the courageous decision. Others questioned the sincerity of his motives. Bradley was visibly shaken when he realized he had lost Sarah for good. To a love so deep, it had led a man to give up his nobility. Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins welcomed the couple with tears of happiness. She had sensed from the beginning that their feelings were genuine, and now she saw her daughter truly happy for the first time in years. Julian's decision to give up everything for love had dispelled any doubt about his sincere intentions. The following months were ones of rebuilding in every sense. Julian learned to work the land for real, his hands growing calloused and his body getting used to actual physical labor. Sarah expanded her sewing work, creating a small workshop that served the entire region. Together they built a simple but deeply satisfying life. The wedding took place 1 year after Julian's return, in a simple ceremony at the church where everything had once gone wrong. The whole community was present, celebrating a love that had overcome social differences, past lies, and society's prejudices. It was proof that true love could overcome any obstacle when both parties were willing to fight for it. During the reception, Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins made an emotional toast, saying she had gained not just a son-in-law, but a son who had proven himself worthy of her daughter's love through actions, not just words. Julian replied that he had found in Willow Creek much more than love. He had found a family and a purpose that no noble title could ever provide. 5 years later, they still lived happily on their small property. They had 2 young children who played among the apple orchards that had become a symbol of their love. Julian never showed any regret over his decision, and Sarah had learned to trust him completely once again. In the evenings, when they put the children to bed, they would sit on the porch and talk about how their lives had been transformed. Julian once said that the best decision he had made was not renouncing the dukedom, but having the courage to pursue true love. Sarah replied that her best decision was forgiving and giving love a second chance. The story of the Duke who became a farmer for love became a legend in the region. Young couples visited Willow Creek to see the place where love had conquered all conventions. Julian and Sarah welcomed these visitors with joy, always willing to share their experience that true love requires courage, honesty, and the willingness to completely transform one's own life. Years later, when their children asked about their father's past, Julian told the complete story, including the mistakes he had made. He taught that lying, even with good intentions, always brings painful consequences, but that true love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds when there is sincere remorse and a willingness to change. Sarah would always add that she had learned the importance of forgiveness and second chances. She explained to the children that love is not just a feeling, but a daily choice to trust, support, and build together, even when the road gets hard. It was the most valuable lesson they could pass on to the next generation. The garden they had started as a small vegetable patch had become one of the most prosperous properties in the region. Julian applied the administrative knowledge he had acquired as a duke to develop innovative agricultural techniques. Sarah expanded her sewing business into a cooperative that employed several women from the town. Together, they became examples of how love can transform not just 2 lives, but an entire community. The prosperity they brought to Willow Creek was a direct result of the dedication and teamwork they had built on solid foundations of regained trust and mutual commitment. During the town festivals, when the story was told to visitors, questions about regrets always came up. Julian consistently replied that his only regret was having lied from the start, needlessly prolonging the suffering of both of them. If he could go back in time, he would have told the truth from the very beginning, trusting in love to overcome the differences. Sarah always added that her regret was having doubted her own heart so much. She said there had been signs that his love was genuine, but that the fear of being hurt again had almost destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to her in life. It was a reminder that sometimes you have to risk your heart to find true happiness. Julian's physical transformation over the years was remarkable. The elegant and refined man who had arrived in town had become a robust farmer, tanned by the sun. His hands, once soft, now bore the marks of honest work. But what was most impressive was how his eyes shone with genuine happiness, something he had never possessed during his aristocratic life. Sarah had also changed, but in a different way. The sadness she carried in her eyes when they first met had been replaced by a serene glow of someone who had found her place in the world. She had become more confident, expanding her horizons through her thriving business and the happy family she had built. When they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, they organized a big party for the entire community. During the speeches, the town's mayor spoke about how they had become local symbols that true love can overcome any obstacle. It was a story that the residents proudly told to visitors from other regions. Bradley, who had married a young woman from another town years before, attended the party with his family. During a private conversation with Julian, he admitted that it had taken him years to accept that Sarah had made the right choice. He said that the love Julian had shown was something he could never have offered, and that he was grateful she had found true happiness. The reconciliation with Bradley was important for everyone involved. It showed that it was possible to overcome past hurts when there is maturity and acknowledgement of one's own mistakes. Bradley became a respectful friend of the family, and his children occasionally played with Julian and Sarah's children. Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins, now a doting grandmother of 4 grandchildren, used to say she had won life's lottery by seeing her daughter so happy. She spent her days helping around the property and telling stories to the children. Her relationship with Julian was especially affectionate, as he treated her with the respect and care she deserved. On weekends, the family had the habit of having picnics in the wildflower meadows, where Julian had almost confessed his love for the first time. It was a special place for them, a reminder of how love had grown gradually, despite all the lies and complications. The children loved running among the tall flowers while their parents reminisced about their story. On one of those special afternoons, the eldest son asked why his father had chosen to be a farmer instead of a duke. Julian patiently explained that titles and wealth don't bring happiness if there's no true love to share them with. He said he would rather be an ordinary man truly loved than a lonely duke surrounded by falseness. The youngest daughter, always curious, wanted to know if her mother had gotten very angry when she discovered the truth. Sarah replied that she had been deeply hurt at first, but that she had learned the difference between anger born of wounded pride and pain from betrayed love. She explained that when you truly love, forgiveness becomes possible, especially when there is genuine remorse. These family conversations always ended with group hugs and renewed promises of mutual honesty. Julian and Sarah had built a family where open communication was valued above all else, where mistakes could be admitted and forgiven, where love grew through transparency. 15 years after their wedding, they received an unexpected letter from Richmond. Julian's cousin, who had inherited the dukedom, wrote asking for advice on administrative matters. He had discovered documents showing how Julian had managed the estates with exceptional efficiency and wanted to apply similar methods. The letter brought an interesting reflection for Julian. He realized he had left behind not only privileges, but also responsibilities that he might be able to fulfill in a different way. He talked with Sarah about the possibility of helping his cousin as a consultant, keeping his simple life but contributing with the knowledge he had acquired. Sarah fully supported the idea, as long as it didn't mean a return to aristocratic life. Together, they developed a plan where Julian could offer administrative consulting for rural properties, using his unique experience as someone who had been a duke and had become a successful farmer. The new work allowed them to occasionally travel to other regions, always returning to their home in Willow Creek. Julian became known as an innovative consultant who understood both aristocratic theory and peasant practice. It was a way of using his past to build an even better future. During one of those consulting trips, they met a young couple going through a crisis similar to the one they had faced years before. The wife had discovered that her husband had lied about important aspects of his past, and the relationship was hanging by a thread. Julian and Sarah spent an entire night talking with the couple, sharing their own experience of how they had overcome lies and rebuilt trust. It was moving for them to realize how their story could help other couples find paths to reconciliation. That experience inspired them to start offering guidance to couples in crisis, not as professionals, but as people who had lived through difficult situations and found paths to healing. Their home in Willow Creek became a refuge for couples seeking examples of how love can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The volunteer work with other couples brought a new dimension to their lives. They discovered that helping others rebuild relationships strengthened their own marriage even more. Each story of reconciliation they witnessed was a reminder of how blessed they had been to find the strength to forgive and start over. 20 years after their first meeting in the apple garden, Julian and Sarah organized a vow renewal. They wanted to celebrate not only 2 decades of marriage, but all the personal and joint growth they had experienced. The ceremony took place in the same garden where it all began, now expanded into a thriving property. During the renewal ceremony, they rewrote their own vows, incorporating lessons learned over the years. Julian promised never to keep secrets again, no matter how small, and to always put honesty above convenience. Sarah promised never again to let the fear of the past keep her from trusting the future. Their children, now teenagers, took part in the ceremony, carrying symbols that represented different aspects of their parents' journey. Wildflowers for the first declaration of love, apple saplings for the first shared garden, and 2 simple rings that replaced the originals to symbolize the simplicity they had chosen. The vow renewal ceremony became an annual event in Willow Creek, where other couples were encouraged to renew their commitments. Julian and Sarah had started a tradition that strengthened marital bonds throughout the entire community. It was their way of giving back the warmth and support they had received during difficult times. During one of the renewal anniversaries, a journalist from Richmond arrived in town, interested in writing a story about their journey. Julian and Sarah agreed to the interview, but only on the condition that the focus be on lessons about love and forgiveness, not on sensationalizing the aristocratic renunciation. The article, published months later, brought an avalanche of letters from readers who had been inspired by the story. Many shared their own experiences of how they had overcome marital crises, creating a support network that extended far beyond Willow Creek. One of the most touching letters came from an elderly woman who had lived through 50 years of unhappy marriage because she had not been able to forgive an old betrayal. After reading the story, she found the strength to talk honestly with her husband for the first time in decades, beginning a reconciliation that both had thought impossible. These reactions confirmed for Julian and Sarah that their decision to share their story had been the right one. It was not about unnecessary exposure, but about offering hope to people facing similar situations. It was gratifying to know that their experience could serve as a beacon for others navigating marital storms. As the years went by, the property in Willow Creek became increasingly prosperous. Julian had applied sustainable farming methods that attracted students and researchers from universities. Sarah had expanded her sewing cooperative to include local crafts that were sold in large urban centers. Financial success, however, never changed the simple lifestyle they had chosen. They continued living in the same house, eating at the same tables, sleeping in the same room they had furnished at the beginning of their marriage. The extra money was invested in the community and in social projects that benefited the entire region. One of their most beloved projects was a technical school they had founded to teach sustainable agriculture and traditional crafts. Young people from across the region came to study methods that combined local tradition with modern innovation. It was a way of ensuring that Willow Creek would continue to prosper even after they were no longer there. During the classes they occasionally taught at the school, Julian and Sarah always included lessons about relationships and communication. They taught that professional and personal success depended on the ability to be honest, to ask for forgiveness when needed, and to work as a team with mutual respect. When they celebrated 25 years of marriage, their children were already independent adults, but both had chosen to remain in the region. The eldest son had become a veterinarian and cared for the animals of the entire rural area. Their daughter had studied business administration and helped manage the cooperatives that her parents had created. Seeing their children building prosperous and ethical lives in the same community where they had been raised was one of Julian and Sarah's greatest joys. They had managed to pass on solid values without imposing choices, allowing each child to find their own path within principles of honesty and service to the community. The eldest granddaughter, the couple's daughter, loved hearing her grandparents' story and always asked for details about how Grandpa Duke had become Grandpa Farmer. Julian told the story in a way adapted to her age, always emphasizing that lies, even well-intentioned ones, can hurt the people we love. During one of these conversations, The little granddaughter asked if he missed being a duke. Julian sat her on his lap and showed her the whole property through the window, the lush green fields, the family gathered in the backyard, the people working happily in the fields. He said he had never been as rich as he was at that moment. The end. What an incredible story, right? Now tell us, which moment moved you the most? Do you believe Sarah made the right decision in forgiving Julian? Leave your honest opinion in the comments and share this story with someone who needs to believe in the power of true love. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.